What happens when the weapon Russia trusted for centuries suddenly turns against it on the battlefield? That question now hangs over eastern Ukraine as winter, long mythologized as Moscow's silent ally, begins tearing into Russian forces, not as protection, but as punishment. And if General Winter is no longer fighting for the Kremlin, who is truly winning this phase of the war, this winter offensive was supposed to be different. Russian commanders entered late December, convinced that freezing temperatures would finally slow Ukraine's drones, sap morale, and harden the ground for armored movement. Instead, the cold has exposed the deepest weaknesses in Russia's campaign around Pokrovsk and nearby sectors. According to frontline updates echoed by Western reporting, Russian units remain on the attack, but their momentum has stalled under conditions that punish preparation gaps more ruthlessly than Ukrainian fire ever could. Temperatures across Donetsk Oblast plunged well below freezing in January, with nighttime lows sinking into the mid-teens Fahrenheit. Ukrainian troops fighting from fortified defensive positions were largely ready. Shelters were reinforced, rotations planned, and supply routes kept open. Russian forces, by contrast, advanced into exposed terrain with minimal winter logistics. This difference, rarely dramatic on a map, has become decisive on the ground. Ukrainian military spokespeople described Russian assaults shrinking from coordinated pushes into scattered, disorganized probes. Western analysts reading satellite imagery and intercepted communications see the same pattern: vehicles immobilized by frozen fuel systems, infantry slowed by frostbite, and commanders forced to choose between halting attacks or sacrificing troops to the cold. The Kremlin has chosen neither pause nor retreat. Instead, assaults continue even as casualty rates climb, for reasons that have little to do with bullets. The irony is impossible to ignore. For generations, Russian military identity has leaned on winter as a strategic equalizer. Napoleon learned it. Hitler learned it. The assumption was always that Russia could endure cold better than its enemies. But in Ukraine, Russia is not defending its homeland. It is projecting force outward, stretching logistics, morale, and command discipline to their limits. Under those conditions, winter no longer favors the attacker, it devours them. This reversal has not gone unnoticed in Western capitals. NATO intelligence assessments, cited by major English-language outlets, note that weather-driven attrition is now compounding Russia's structural manpower problems. With experienced units already depleted, replacements arriving at the front are older, less trained, and less equipped for extreme cold. The result is a cycle in which winter reduces combat effectiveness, forcing commanders to throw more men forward to maintain pressure, which in turn increases losses without meaningful gains. For Ukraine, the situation presents an unexpected strategic advantage. While Kyiv continues to face Russian missile and drone strikes against its energy infrastructure, frontline conditions favor defense. Stable positions allow Ukrainian forces to conserve manpower, while Russia bleeds strength simply by staying in the field. Western military experts argue that this asymmetry matters far beyond Pokrovsk. It shapes how long Russia can sustain offensive operations through winter and into spring. The political implications reach even further. With Donald Trump now back in the White House, Washington's focus has shifted toward measurable outcomes rather than symbolic gestures. A Russian winter offensive grinding itself down under weather stress reinforces arguments inside NATO that Ukraine can hold key terrain if supported consistently. It also undermines Moscow's narrative that time and endurance inevitably favor Russia. Yet the most dangerous aspect of this phase may be psychological. When soldiers realize that nature itself has become hostile and that leadership is unwilling or unable to protect them, discipline erodes. Analysts warn that winter is not just freezing Russian bodies, but cracking the cohesion of units already stretched thin. Meanwhile, as temperatures continue to drop and assaults continue to fail, what unfolds next on the frozen approaches to Pokrovsk may shock even seasoned observers. Russia's battlefield problems do not begin at the trench line. They begin far behind it, where frozen logistics are quietly dismantling the offensive before soldiers ever make contact with Ukrainian positions. While Moscow's strategy assumes relentless pressure can compensate for losses, winter has turned supply chains themselves into choke points, and once those arteries freeze, assaults lose their force long before they reach Ukrainian defenses. In theory, winter should simplify movement. Frozen ground reduces mud, allowing vehicles to maneuver. In practice, Russian formations advancing toward Pokrovsk are discovering that cold disables just as effectively as it immobilizes. Fuel thickens, batteries drain faster, optics fail, and engines stall after hours of exposure. Western defense analysts tracking Russian vehicle losses note a sharp rise in non-combat breakdowns during January. Machines abandoned, not because they were hit, but because they simply would not start again. Ukraine's posture highlights the contrast. Defending forces operate from prepared positions with layered logistics. Supplies rotate forward in planned intervals, and units cycle out of exposed sectors before exhaustion sets in. Russian assault units, by contrast, often move without vehicular resupply at all. What a soldier carries becomes the limit of endurance, food, fuel, insulation, ammunition. Once those are gone, the offensive collapses into survival. This imbalance is now visible in the tempo of combat. Independent assessments cited in Western media show Russian attacks continuing daily, but rarely advancing. The pattern repeats: infantry probes forward, stall under cold, and Ukrainian fire withdraw or freeze in place, then repeat the attempt hours later with fresh troops. The cost accumulates not just in casualties, but in morale and readiness. Winter stretches every delay into a crisis. The logistical strain is compounded by Ukraine's expanding campaign against Russian energy infrastructure. As Kyiv increases strikes on refineries, depots, and power nodes inside Russia, the ripple effects reach the front. Analysts at Defense News and other outlets have pointed out that fuel shortages do not need to be absolute to matter. Even localized disruptions force prioritization. When commanders must choose between powering rear area facilities and sustaining frontline units in sub-zero temperatures, someone goes without. For NATO planners, this linkage is critical. Energy warfare and frontline logistics are no longer separate theaters, they reinforce each other. Ukrainian strikes aimed at Russia's economic backbone indirectly weaken its winter warfighting capacity. Every refinery outage tightens the margin for error on the battlefield, where cold leaves no room for improvisation. Russian doctrine traditionally accepts losses in exchange for momentum. But winter punishes that calculus. An exhausted soldier in summer may still advance. An exhausted soldier in -10-degree conditions may simply stop moving. Western military experts argue that this changes how offensives fail, not in dramatic breakthroughs or collapses, but in slow attrition that drains combat power invisibly. The Kremlin's response has been to press harder. Commanders continue to demand results, even as logistics falter. That pressure filters downward, encouraging risky assaults and discouraging pauses that might preserve equipment and personnel. From a strategic perspective, this is a dangerous feedback loop. Winter reduces effectiveness, which triggers more aggressive orders, which then produce higher losses for diminishing returns. For Ukraine, holding firm becomes a force multiplier. Defensive success does not require counteroffensives. It requires patience. Each failed Russian push burns manpower and material that cannot be easily replaced. Western officials tracking the conflict describe this phase as attritional inversion, Russia bleeding itself, while Ukraine conserves strength. Yet this is only the logistical side of the equation. When supply failures intersect with human endurance, the consequences become far more severe. And as Russian soldiers remain exposed longer and longer without relief, what happens to the men themselves may prove even more damaging than frozen engines or stalled convoys. Yet, as logistics seize up and assaults slow to a crawl, what unfolds among the troops left waiting in the cold is about to redefine this winter campaign. The most brutal consequences of winter are no longer measured in kilometers gained or lost, but in bodies that never make it back from the line. As Russia's logistics falter and assaults stall, frontline soldiers are paying the price in ways that rarely appear on official casualty charts. Cold exposure and abandonment have become as lethal as Ukrainian fire, turning the winter battlefield into a slow-motion crisis of human endurance. Reports emerging from the Pokrovsk axis describe Russian troops spending days in open terrain with little more than what they can carry. In sub-zero conditions, even minor wounds become life-threatening. Western medical analysts familiar with cold weather combat stress that hypothermia accelerates blood loss, slows reaction times, and reduces the ability to self-administer aid. In practice, this means a soldier who might survive a shrapnel wound in summer can freeze to death within hours in January. The evacuation problem magnifies everything. Russian doctrine prioritizes momentum over recovery, and that approach has collided with winter realities. Stretchers freeze. Vehicles cannot reach forward positions. Medics are scarce. Analysts citing open-source intelligence note growing delays between injury and evacuation, sometimes measured in many hours, sometimes in days. Each delay sharply reduces survival rates, even for wounds that would otherwise be manageable. Ukraine's experience offers a stark contrast. Defensive positions allow for structured casualty rotation and sheltered treatment. Even under fire, wounded Ukrainian soldiers are more likely to be pulled back along pre-planned routes. The difference is not technological, it is organizational. Winter rewards preparation and punishes improvisation. Russia is improvising under fire. Morale suffers accordingly. Soldiers facing the cold, with no assurance of evacuation, begin to understand a harsh truth. Survival depends less on skill than on luck. Western psychologists who study combat stress warn that this realization corrodes discipline faster than fear of the enemy. When troops believe they are disposable, cohesion collapses. Orders are followed mechanically, not willingly. The demographic shift within Russian units intensifies the problem. With many experienced troops, already lost replacements arriving at the front are often older, less fit, and unfamiliar with extreme winter operations. Open-source casualty data, analyzed by European researchers, indicates a rising average age among Russian losses. Cold amplifies physical weakness. Aging joints stiffen. Circulation slows. Recovery takes longer if it happens at all. At the strategic level, this creates a silent drain on Russia's combat power. Even soldiers who survive frostbite or prolonged exposure often become non-effective for weeks or permanently. They are counted as alive, but they are no longer fighters. Western analysts describe this as hidden attrition losses that do not appear dramatic, but steadily hollow out units from within. The Kremlin's messaging avoids this reality. Official statements continue to emphasize resilience and sacrifice, framing losses as inevitable. But information leaks through social media, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations tell a different story. Fear is shifting. Soldiers are no longer just afraid of Ukrainian drones or artillery. They are afraid of being left in the cold. For Ukraine, this dynamic reshapes the battlefield without a single counterattack. Holding positions forces Russian troops to remain exposed longer, increasing the toll winter takes on them. Every hour spent stalled in freezing conditions is another erosion of Russia's offensive capacity. For NATO and US planners under the Trump administration, this matters. Attrition driven by weather is unpredictable but powerful. It suggests that Russia's ability to regenerate forces may be overstated, especially when winter casualties quietly exceed combat losses. The longer this phase lasts, the more uneven the balance becomes. Yet winter's cruelty carries a deeper irony. The very force Russia once celebrated as a national protector is now stripping away its manpower in silence. And this raises a question that echoes far beyond Pokrovsk. If General Winter no longer answers to Moscow, what does that mean for the myths Russia has built its strategy upon? What followed next shocked analysts even more as history itself began to turn against the Kremlin's narrative. For centuries, Russian military identity has been wrapped in a powerful legend that winter itself rises to defend the nation. From school books to state propaganda, General Winter has been portrayed as an almost sentient force, an invisible commander that breaks invaders who dare step onto Russian soil. But in Ukraine, that myth is unraveling, and the reason is simple yet devastating. Russia is no longer the defender, it is the invader. History offers the parallels Moscow prefers to forget. Napoleon's Grande Armée collapsed, not because it lacked courage, but because extended supply lines and brutal cold destroyed cohesion. Nazi Germany's Operation Barbarossa failed not only due to Soviet resistance, but because winter exposed logistical arrogance and overreach. In each case, the attackers underestimated the environment and overestimated their ability to endure it. Today, Russia stands in that same historical position, only now it is facing its own legend as an enemy. Western military historians emphasize that winter has never been neutral. It punishes whichever side is least prepared, least supplied, and most exposed. When Russia fought defensive wars, winter amplified its strengths, depth, reserves, infrastructure. In Ukraine, the situation is inverted. Russian forces operate at the end of stretched supply chains in hostile territory, with limited shelter and unreliable rotation. Under those conditions, winter ceases to be a shield and becomes a blade. This shift has profound psychological consequences. Myths matter in war. They shape expectations, morale, and planning assumptions. When Russian soldiers discover that winter no longer favors them when they freeze, stall, and die in the same way past invaders once did, the narrative collapses. Western analysts argue that this cognitive dissonance is more dangerous than physical losses. It erodes belief in inevitability, a core pillar of Kremlin messaging. The contrast with Ukraine is striking. Ukrainian forces are now the side benefiting from time and terrain. Holding prepared positions allows them to let winter work indirectly in their favor. They do not need dramatic offensives. They need endurance. As long as Russian troops remain exposed, the environment does the work. This is a reversal few in Moscow anticipated when the war began. Strategically, this matters for NATO and the United States. Under President Donald Trump, Washington has emphasized outcomes and leverage over symbolism. Russia's failure to translate winter into advantage weakens its bargaining position. If Moscow cannot generate momentum even during conditions it once considered favorable, its ability to dictate terms diminishes. Energy warfare deepens the irony. Russia has attempted to weaponize winter by striking Ukraine's power and heating infrastructure, hoping cold would break civilian resilience. Yet on the battlefield, cold is breaking Russian formations instead. Analysts note the contradiction, a state trying to use winter offensively while being defeated by it tactically. This mismatch highlights systemic planning failures rather than temporary setbacks. There is also a warning embedded in this reversal. Myths that go unchallenged eventually distort strategy. By relying on historical memory rather than present capability, Russia misjudged both Ukraine's preparation and its own limits. Winter did not change. Russia's role did. And that difference has rewritten the rules. As the legend of General Winter fractures under modern conditions, one question looms large for military planners on all sides: if history no longer guarantees protection, what happens when desperation replaces belief? Yet as this myth collapses, the Kremlin's response has not been reform, but improvisation, revealing a new layer of weakness that few expected to see. When strategy fails, armies improvise. On the frozen front lines east of Pokrovsk, Russia's improvisation has become impossible to hide and even harder to defend. What was once framed as tactical flexibility now looks increasingly like desperation, exposing structural weaknesses that winter has dragged into the open. As temperatures plunged, Russian units began relying on equipment and solutions that would be unthinkable in a well-prepared force. Reports cited by Western media describe soldiers advancing with minimal protective gear, inconsistent winter uniforms, and inadequate shelter. Some units received lightweight camouflage covers promoted as thermal protection, despite offering little insulation against sub-zero winds. The intent may have been to reduce detection by Ukrainian drones, but the trade-off has been brutal concealment. Without warmth is survival without time. This improvisation reflects deeper shortages. Russian industry, already strained by sanctions and wartime demand struggles, to supply modern winter gear at scale. Western defense economists note that replacing lost equipment is not just expensive, it is slow. Cold weather clothing vehicles adapted for winter operations and reliable medical logistics all require manufacturing capacity that cannot be surged overnight. As losses mount, quality declines. Manpower trends amplify the problem. Increasingly, Russian assault units include older reservists, foreign recruits, and convicts, offered incentives to fill gaps. Analysts tracking prisoner-of-war demographics report fewer elite formations and more poorly trained replacements at the front. Winter magnifies the consequences of this shift. Cold does not discriminate, but it does punish the unfit faster. The operational impact is visible in combat patterns. Assaults appear shorter, less coordinated, and more cautious, yet paradoxically more frequent. Commanders push small groups forward, repeatedly probing for weakness that never appears. Each failed attempt drains stamina and morale, but higher command pressure leaves little room for adaptation. Improvisation becomes routine, and routine becomes exhaustion. From a NATO perspective, this signals something critical. Russia's ability to learn and adjust under pressure, a strength once assumed, may be eroding. Improvised solutions can bridge gaps briefly, but they cannot substitute for systemic capacity. Western military analysts warn that an army relying on ad hoc fixes in winter conditions risks compounding losses faster than it can replace them. Ukraine's role in this equation is indirect, but decisive. By holding terrain and forcing Russia to remain exposed, Ukrainian forces deny Moscow the pause it needs to regroup. Every day without relief pushes Russian units further into improvisation. Meanwhile, Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy and logistics nodes deepen shortages that frontline troops feel almost immediately. This dynamic carries strategic consequences beyond the battlefield. An army seen improvising under duress projects weakness, not resilience. For Moscow, that perception matters internationally. Allies, adversaries, and neutral observers reassess Russia's capacity to sustain prolonged conflict. Under the Trump administration, U.S. policymakers focused on leverage. Note that visible decline alters negotiating positions long before formal talks begin. Winter, then, is not just freezing Russian troops. It is stripping away the illusion of control. Improvisation reveals what doctrine conceals an overstretched system trying to appear stronger than it is. And as these cracks widen, the question is no longer whether Russia can adapt, but whether adaptation is still possible under the weight of cumulative losses. What followed next shocked analysts even more, as the consequences of this winter-driven decline began to ripple far beyond the front lines. The true danger of winter-driven attrition is not what it does today, but what it sets in motion for the months ahead. As Russia's winter offensive grinds down under cold logistics failure and declining morale, the strategic consequences are beginning to crystallize, and they extend well beyond the frozen fields around Pokrovsk. From a purely military perspective, Russia is losing something harder to replace than equipment time. Winter was meant to be a window of pressure, a season in which Ukraine would be weakened by cold energy shortages and fatigue. Instead, Russian forces are emerging from winter depleted, while Ukraine preserves manpower and defensive cohesion. Western analysts argue that this inversion matters enormously for the spring and summer phases. An army that spends winter bleeding strength enters the next campaign already behind. This has direct implications for NATO and the United States. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. strategy has emphasized cost-benefit realism rather than open-ended commitment. Russia's failure to capitalize on winter strengthens the argument that sustained targeted support for Ukraine produces measurable results. Not breakthroughs, but erosion, steady compounding pressure that Russia struggles to absorb. For NATO planners, winter has become proof that time does not automatically favor Moscow. Energy warfare ties these threads together. Ukraine's expanding strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, refineries, depots, and power nodes are no longer just economic pressure tools. They feed directly into battlefield outcomes by constraining logistics in the harshest conditions. Analysts at major Western outlets describe this as strategic synchronization, economic disruption, reinforcing military attrition. Each successful strike tightens the margin Russia has to operate in extreme cold. Inside Russia's ranks, the psychological effects are already visible. Officers requesting transfers, units showing reluctance to advance, and soldiers increasingly aware that survival depends more on weather than command competence. This erosion of confidence does not reset with the seasons. Winter leaves scars, physical and mental, that carry forward. Even when temperatures rise, the memory of abandonment remains. For Ukraine, the challenge ahead is restraint. Holding firm has worked, but pressure will build to exploit Russian weakness. Western military experts caution that timing is everything. A premature push could reverse winter's gains. Patience combined with continued strikes on logistics and energy targets may yield greater strategic payoff than dramatic offensives. For Moscow, the dilemma is stark. Adaptation requires reform, better logistics, realistic planning, and acknowledgement of limits. Yet reform clashes with the Kremlin's narrative of control and inevitability. Denial may feel safer politically, but winter has shown the cost of believing one's own myth. As spring approaches, analysts are watching closely. Will Russia regroup, or will winter's damage define the year ahead? Will Ukraine turn endurance into leverage, and will the West recognize that some of the most decisive battles are not fought in headlines, but in months of quiet attrition? What happens next will not arrive suddenly, but its impact may shape the war's trajectory far more than any single offensive.